can assume that I'm not making any money on all these low-end cards, but the PayPal and the bank account say differently, and I'm having a ton of fun doing it.
What's up, wrestling fans, trading card collectors? Welcome to another episode of Wrestling with Cards. Today we've got another interview. Hope to start bringing you guys one or two of these a month. Today we've got on MIke Sommer. Mike is the host of the WaxpackHero Sports Card Minute podcast, which you can go check that on popular platforms. Also, I'll link to that in the description. Mike is also a card shop owner. Well, a shop within a shop, store within a store. But I'll let him tell you more about that on the video. One of the big reasons I wanted to have Mike on is to talk about the business of the hobby. Something that I don't think enough people talk about. Sure, you see on social media people flexing their cards and it's worth this much. And that's not what we're necessarily talking about today. Mike is a perfect example of somebody who shows you that if you're willing to put in the work, you can get some huge gains. You can fund that PC piece for free. You can make some money to pay some bills if you had to do it, or it's just there to do whatever you want with, if you're willing to put in the work. So I hope anybody watching this today can really learn something, pick something up from something in this interview that either me or Mike has to say, and kind of apply that to the way that you operate in the hobby going forward. If this is your first time on my channel, thanks for stopping by. Thanks for giving me some of your time out of your busy day to check out my content. Greatly appreciated. If you like what you're seeing, hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell notifications. I've also helped launch 2 podcasts recently. The first being Wrestling with Cards, same title as this video, so that should be easy to find. It's mainly a companion piece to all of these videos. So for example, Introduction to Wrestling Cards, I do an Introduction to Wrestling Cards. I did a whole video series, I'm sure some of you have seen it, about the 94-95 Action Pack set. I talk a little bit about that, and so on. I've also teamed up with Tony Vella from WrestlingTradingCards.com, and we do Worlds Collide. 2 different wrestling card personalities getting together talking all things wrestling cards. You can find the links to those podcasts in the show notes. You can also find them on all of the popular podcast platforms, anything you're used to listening to. Make sure to give us a good review, share it with your friends, spread the word, let's build this community. Also, be on the lookout for some fun ways that you can help show your support of this channel. And I've taken up too much of your time already, let's get into the interview. What's up, everyone? Mike Sommer, welcome to the show. Happy to have you on.
Hey, happy to be here.
Thanks for coming on. And for anybody that's not familiar with your stuff, because I know there's a lot of wrestling fans on this that maybe aren't as into sports cards. Hopefully we can change that, and hopefully we can get sports cards people into wrestling. But people that are unfamiliar with you, just give a brief introduction of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so MIke Sommer, known online as WaxpackHero, collected, for years since the 80s, took a break and came back into the hobby about 2015. And so much had changed since the 80s and 90s when I had last been collecting. One of the big things that I realized early on was that I was going to need to do something to help offset the cost of collecting in the modern day. And so really started to get interested in buying and selling in a way that allowed me to generate some extra profit to be able to cover the cost of the cards I wanted to keep for my own collection. As I did more and more of that, I found that I wanted to be able to give back a little bit and find a way to help other people learn and get back up to speed who had been taking a break maybe like I had. And so I started the blog, WaxpackHero.com, where I started to both celebrate the cards that I was collecting and the cards that I still enjoyed from when I was young, but also to have a focus on the business side of the hobby too, and provide some tips and strategies on how to buy and sell to create a self-sustaining hobby. That led to me starting the WaxpackHero Sports Card Minute podcast a little over a year ago. And I'm approaching episode 100 of the podcast now. And this last summer, during the midst of the pandemic, I had an opportunity to buy out one of the local card shops in my community and kind of took over the operation of running that card shop as a part-time side hustle as well. And so I'm involved on both the content creation side of the thing, running an LCS, and also selling online. So just I'm headfirst in the midst of this collecting hobby.
That's how I like it. And we're going to jump into details little by little of everything you just mentioned. So strap in. You're in for a good conversation, everybody. Let's start with wrestling cards. This is a wrestling card podcast. Generally, I like to talk about other stuff too. What got you into wrestling cards at any point within your collecting, whether it was years ago, whether you've just recently started? Like, what got you into it? What sparked the interest?
Yeah, so I had a handful of wrestling cards when I was young from the 80s. Some of those cards that came out in the late 80s and early 90s. I had some of those. I always watched, some of the WWF at the time stuff on Saturday mornings when I
Yep.
was growing up. And so Hogan and Macho Man and Ultimate Warrior and all those guys were guys that I grew up watching. Um, I never got super into the card aspect, though I did have some in my collection, but didn't get super into it. As I came back into the hobby here over the last couple of years, one of those things that stands out is the nostalgia aspect, and I
Absolutely.
just had a lot of fun going back and building some oddball sets, building some kind of non-mainstream type sets of the other sports. And I said, you know what? A lot of these, right or wrong, a lot of these wrestling cards from that era could be considered right along with those other non-mainstream releases as an oddball set from when I was young. And with some of those different characters and wrestlers that were big and important to me when I was young. So maybe I should start to explore a little bit more about what these are. And so I started to dig in a little bit, by no means an expert, but there's a few guys like you, Brett McGrath from Stacking Slabs, and a few other names. Even on the Fat Packs podcast, they would occasionally have a featured segment on a wrestling set that started to pique my interest. And so I learned a little bit more. And so I've been, by no means am I anywhere close to the level of knowledge that you've got, but I'm starting to dip my toes in a few sets, specifically the Carnation set from
Yeah.
85, 86. You turned me on to that a couple months ago, and I went all in and tracked down all 6 cards. So I've got that whole set now, which I just think is great. I'm having a ton of fun with it.
It's fun that you can build a set that's only 6 cards, first off, and
Yep.
there's great superstars on there. But also on top of that, the fact that, hey, I've got these cards that came out of hot chocolate boxes. Like, it's just a
Yep.
really cool aspect to me. And that's the one thing about wrestling cards, the just oddball factor. I mean, it makes it a little bit harder to get into sometimes because you don't have all the information that you do with typical sports cards with checklists and everything, because it's just not out there. Are you, like, speaking of food products, are you familiar with the Quaker Dips cards out of Canada?
I am not.
Yeah, that check those out. There's just another weird oddball thing, and those are like they're you can't hardly find them, and when you can find them, they're pretty high in value. I've only seen a couple of graded. I've got a couple of raw ones I'm going to send in, but there's a Hogan one. There's like a 1989 Rockers, which has the Shawn Michaels that's his rookie year of cards. And there's a really cool Ultimate Warrior run from 1988 before he was full-fledged Ultimate Warrior, but it's still a WWF product. Kind of, this is just kind of weird oddball stuff that you find when you get into wrestling.
Quaker Dips.
Yep, like Quaker, the brand Quaker Oats.
Yep.
Yep, that's that brand.
Okay, I'll check it out. Yeah, I love that kind of stuff. Those oddball food issue type things are some of my favorite sets to collect, even going back in the 70s with, Hostess and Kellogg's and some of that stuff on the baseball side. So the Carnation set was right up my alley. And so, yeah, I'll have to check out this Quaker set too.
Speaking of, you just mentioned the Hostess stuff. Uh, just in general, for your PC collections, whether it's wrestling, non-wrestling, what are you like all into right now?
The biggest thing, so I still have my favorite players in the binders that I started when I was young, right? So I will still track down some of the Jordans and Kobe's and Cubs and, some of those sports cards and sports team cards from when I was young, and continue to build out those binders. The biggest focus right now, though, is probably shifted to be vintage. And I've been gradually working my way back over the last few years from the 70s. And now I've dipped my toes into the 60s. I finished up the 1969 Topps baseball set last year. I'm on the last 10 cards or so from the 1968 Topps baseball set this year. And I've really been kind of tracking those things down, and some of these oddball sets like the Hostess sets and any of those other kind of oddball sets from the 70s and 80s. That dipping my toes into, like I said, with wrestling, and track down the Carnation set. When I bought out the store, there was a whole bunch of 87 Topps wrestling cards, and I've got most of that set now. I still need to pick up a few to finish off that set, but just having fun, really starting to focus on these things that are not mainstream, not the big Zion basketball craze and all of that kind of stuff is just not appealing to me right now as far as something that I want to track down in PC. I'm having a lot more fun on these more affordable, non-mainstream type releases.
And that just segues perfectly into my next question. I guess you could say I preach, I don't know, whatever, about having diversification within just everything in collectibles, investments, whatever. So from a card perspective and hobby, like you're pretty diverse. You got all kinds of stuff. You've got baseballs behind you. You've got the Hacksaw Jim Duggan on the wall, and you're collecting all different kinds of cards. So do you think a diversified collection for your PC, not just stuff you're going to flip, but I mean, you could include that too, I suppose. Do you think that's a good approach? What is good and bad about it? Just give your general thoughts about diversification within the hobby.
Yeah, I think, well, so first of all, if you're talking from a PC perspective, I think the PC should be focused on whatever you enjoy and whatever makes you happy. And so, I know there's a few people who their focus is, I want a small number of cards that are the very best possible cards that I could get. And so their whole PC is focused on 5 to 10 cards that are their kind of dream cards to have. And that's great for them. I know other people who want to have the full run of Topps baseball sets, and that breadth of history is something that is meaningful to them. I have other friends who are player collectors, and their focus is to get as many of one single player as they can. Multiple cards of the same card doesn't matter, right? Like they want just as many cards of that player as they can, or that team that they can. But that's what they enjoy. That's what they find satisfying about the hobby. And so from a PC perspective, I don't think there's a rule of thumb other than your PC should be focused on whatever it is that makes you happy, not what somebody else tells you it should be.
Right.
From a sales perspective, or when I think about the business side of it, of the buying and selling in order to create a self-sustaining hobby, I think diversification is and can be very important from that perspective. One of the things that I focused in on is more of the lower end side of the market, because there are still a lot of people that like base cards, that like just kind of standard insert cards, still build sets and those types of things. And there's so many people that are focused on these super high dollar PSA 10, the high dollar stuff, that they dismiss all of the standard base and insert cards as almost worthless. And I'm able to scoop those up for pennies and sell them for quarters and dollars. And that's been fantastic for me to focus on something like that, where a lot of other people aren't, because it's led to a lot of sales for me to be able to have that self-sustaining hobby.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm kind of everything you just said, I'm also a part of. I like to buy the stuff for fraction of pennies and sell it for, after fees and everything, a quarter. Yep. I like to PC. I recently started. I bought out a collection. I bought actually 2 smaller collections. I'm flipping through the binders and I'm like, man, all this Shaq and all this Rodman, these were my 2-player collectors when I was a kid. I'm back into doing that stuff. Everything from low end to high end, whatever I can get. But then I'm also looking at, you mentioned people just want a handful of cards that are the card. So like with Ric Flair, I recently got this really cool Leaf autograph that there's only 2 of. So I thought that was cool. And then I've got the 82 All-Stars Flair. Like, I don't really necessarily need any more Flairs because those are my 2. So
that's awesome.
I'm with you. And then I have a few sets. I have like the 82, 83 All-Stars. I have the 85 All-Stars. So kind of like you said, mixing in with everything. Next question, you kind of mentioned a little bit about kind of getting into the business and what kind of got you started down that rabbit hole. What was the thing that just kind of pushed you all in to the business side? Because I think a lot of people look at this strictly from a collector's perspective, and they don't understand the monetary value of what you can do within the hobby, whether that's to fund your PC or to make a living off of sales.
Yeah. So I started really small, when I first got the idea, it was selling a little bit of the extra stuff that I had from when I was a kid, and maybe some of the surplus from these first few boxes that I bought when I got back into it. But then I started to have fun doing that, and I built relationships with other people in town and the local card shop in town, and was able to start picking up some small collections for $50, $75, something like that for these first ones. And I would work through it and turn it into 100 or 150, and been able to take that 150, then buy a little bit more.
Right.
And as I was doing that and seeing success with that, I was making money, being able to buy these collections to flip, making enough profit to spend some of that on a few boxes for my own collection, to be able to add cards to my own collection. And there's just something for me that is so cool about saying, I added this set, I added this card that I've always wanted, and it is essentially free to me because I use the profits from these sales. And that for me is just so satisfying to know that I'm expanding my own collection essentially for free. And now it's at the point where I'm also able to do that, add things to my collection for free, and turn it into a legitimate business that is, continuing to grow year after year. And so seeing the success is motivating to me. I have fun buying and selling, and so that's motivating to me. The creating content side of things, came on and added on to that. That's been a ton of fun. All on top of getting and building a collection for free. And so it all just kind of continued to snowball and grow as I went, but I started really small, and it just has been able to grow and grow and grow.
And I think that's a great point because, we see a lot of people out here, whether they're kind of old time collectors that don't understand the current market that we're in, or they complain because they can't get boxes at retail. Like, there's just so many other ways to have fun within the hobby. And I'm kind of like you. Like, I started out, I was like, okay, I want to do this to build a collection and make money. But then that started to be like, I care more about buying and selling than I do trying to get the grail cards. But then that also turned into, well, I'm having more fun doing content than I am trying to chase anything. So yeah, I'm right there with you. You talked about starting small and then growing big. You recently got a store within a store. A little confusing for some people. I knew exactly what you're talking about when you talked about that because I've been in a few. So just tell everybody that backstory. And you started out with a small collection and now you're a store owner. So just talk us through that process.
Yeah. So from a physical in-person sales perspective, I got my start it was probably late 2016 or early 2017. We had a couple small local monthly shows in our area, and I'm friends with, he's like, you should come with me to the show. I was like, I only have like a box worth of stuff to sell. He's like, that's fine. Just, you'll have some space on my table. Don't worry about it. You'll have fun. Trust me. And so I did. And I went with him, and I had my one box of kind of probably cards that were anywhere from $1 to $10 at the most, was the most expensive card that I had. And at the end of the day, I probably made $25, $30, something like that, but I had a ton of fun. And so that's what got me started with the kind of physical in-person sales. We gradually built that to have an LCS or a show at the actual shop. And so this shop had taken over a neighboring storefront. They hosted a lot of like Magic the Gathering tournaments. And so there was a lot of unused square footage on a day-to-day basis that they used and set up tables for these tournaments. Once a month, we turned that space into a card show.
Gotcha.
Along with that space was kind of the main entryway, foyer, and office area of that other storefront. And one of our local friends had approached the shop owner and said, hey, you're not using the space. What would you think about me kind of opening a shop within a shop in that space over there? And they worked out a deal, and our friend ran that shop within a shop for the last couple of years, and had grown that and built up a pretty hefty inventory. And earlier this last year, in mid 2020, it had been a couple of years. He was getting kind of tired of doing that. His day job was shifting, and he needed to make a change in schedule and those types of things. And he approached me and said, hey, would you be interested in buying me out and taking over the shop within a shop? And I talked about it with my wife, and talked about it with the main shop owner, and ultimately I decided to go ahead and do it. And so I went ahead and I bought him out. It came with about 1 million cards of inventory. It came with my rent prepaid through 2021. And so I've got like no overhead, but I've got several hundred square feet worth of dedicated space where it's kind of like a permanent show setup. And I'm working it from about noon to 4 on Saturdays and Sundays, in addition to my day job, throughout the rest of the week. And so I'm only open 8 to 10 hours a week or so, but I've got kind of a permanent show set up inside this other shop. And it's been a blast getting my feet wet, doing kind of a more serious LCS type focus.
And speaking of that, I'm sure you've learned a lot, and the information that you're giving us today is hopefully going to help some others get motivated to go down this path. It's not for everybody, but even if you have a little bit of an entrepreneurial spirit within you and you're collecting, hopefully this will help you out. So as you're going through your back room and you've got all these cards after you've been financially responsible enough previously to be able to afford to buy this out and have all of this stuff without putting yourself in a bind or your family in a bind. Going through those cards, what are you learning as a shop owner? So you're buying and selling. What are you learning going through these boxes as far as like things that, missed opportunities? I know you had a binder, I believe I saw on social media, where it had some like Durant cards and Giannis cards in there. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, sorry, you cut out there. You said a binder of Durant cards, and then it cut out.
Okay, I'll just start from this, and I can edit that out.
Okay.
I think there's some weird internet issues somehow, but so I think I saw recently on social media you had a binder that had Durant cards and like a Giannis card in it. So that's something that people just kind of threw away because they consider junk. I talk a lot about wrestling cards or other kind of pop culture cards people think are junk. As you're going through all of this process, just what can people learn? I know it's kind of a broad question, but there's a lot I think there's a lot to unpack within what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to hit on something else that you had said there. Yeah, I had fortunately been in a situation where I had made enough money throughout the early part of 2020 and had some other money set aside in savings that I was able to use to make this purchase. I did not go into any kind of debt to be able to buy out this shop and to kind of take this upon myself. And so,
let me cut you off for 1 second. You're also not buying $1,500 boxes of Donruss either. Go ahead.
Correct. I am not doing that at this point either. So what are the biggest takeaways? One is I will always tell people to don't just chase the hot thing. Look where other people aren't necessarily focusing their attention. And that led to a lot of the types of cards that I've got. You talked about that binder, and that binder was made up. Those were all part of collections that I purchased before this massive run up we've seen. That Giannis rookie was not a $600 or $700 card or whatever it was at that point. It was like a $10 card, when it was a part of these collections. But people weren't paying attention to base cards then, right? Nobody cared about base cards at that point. And so these were just lumped in to everything else. And that's something that I think I would stress to everybody is, if you want to start to do this, do some research and investigate some of these types of things that aren't necessarily what's hot at the moment, but have potential to continue to grow into that. The other thing that I've learned is not everything is going to have its true potential realized right away when it's brand new. And so I've uncovered boxes of cards that were, a monster box full of older baseball product of prospects from 5 or 6 years ago. And some of those cards in there were thrown in this monster box as a bunch of commons because at the time they were, but in 5 or 6 years, those prospects developed and became stars. And so now I might find a stack of 10 or 15 or 20 of this card that was worth a penny legitimately 5 years ago and is now worth $5 or $10. And all of a sudden now I've got a stack of those, right? So don't always completely dismiss those types of things as worthless right away. You never know what they might turn into. And the other thing is, I think is foundational, is there's money to be made on this hobby at all levels of the price ranges if you're willing to put in some work. Yeah. And if you just want something that is going to take you 5 minutes worth of time, I got this and I'm going to list it on eBay and it's going to take me 5 minutes. Yeah, it might be more challenging, but if you're able to put in some work to sort, list, and grind out those orders on places like Sport Lots, there's money to be made if you're willing to put in some work.
Yeah, and another thing, just piling on top of that, I think a lot of people say, yeah, well, filling out orders for eBay and Sports Lots, like it's too time consuming, and time is money. Well, what else are you doing with your time? Are you playing video games, binge watching Netflix? Like it's all a priority thing. And I understand where they're coming from, but like I'm all in on this stuff. So there's just nothing else I'd rather be doing than trying to grind away quarters into dollars, into $10, into 20, into huge PC pieces. So
yeah, it's important to consider, right? Your time is still important, but like you said, if this is also something that you enjoy doing and it functions as somewhat of an entertainment for you as well, then that's a whole different story, right? That your hourly rate, in my opinion, is really only relevant if you're talking about comparing the time that you're spending trying to make money on cards to another money-making venture that you could be doing, whether that's overtime at your main job, whether that's some other kind of side hustle. Then yeah, it might be fair to compare what is my equivalent per hour rate with cards versus what I could be making at this other venture. But if it's the money that you're spending doing cards compared to, like you said, binge watching Netflix or just screwing around, then like it's not really an apples to apples thing. It's kind of a false argument, in my opinion.
I'm with you. And I don't know about you, I'm speaking for myself here. When you get to the point where you're just as excited about a 50-cent profit as you are $1,000 profit on an item and anything in between, like I think that's at the point where you're like, all right, I'm in.
Yeah, I think so. I love that kind of stuff, but it's partially because I'm proving people wrong. Yeah. All of the naysayers who say there's no money in that, you can't do anything, like, all right, well, I'm setting my all-time record sales in Sport Lots in the month of January, and I'm going to be able to buy all kinds of cards that I want for my PC. I'm going to have money banked up to buy that next collection that walks into the shop or that reaches out on email, because I was willing to put in a little bit of work. And so you can complain that there's no money, or that I'm not, or you can assume that I'm not making any money on all these low end cards, but the PayPal and the bank account say differently, and I'm having a ton of fun doing it.
Couldn't agree with you more. And once again, this is just transitioning perfectly into the next question I had. Talk a little bit about the misconceptions about, I guess, money. We're talking a lot about money, and that's a huge part of the hobby, in my opinion. There's a big misconception about collectors versus investors, where you fall in the middle. I've got my opinions. I think sometimes like the collectors end up with the best stuff, the most valuable stuff. But even when there's a huge price tag that could be like life-changing money, they won't let go of it. Whereas opposed to the investors want to get rid of stuff too quick and don't realize the long-term opportunity. So just talk a little bit about some misconceptions about money, investors, collectors, etc.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I mean, that's a perennial argument that's really been coming up, especially over these last couple of years, but it's been there all along. Are sports cards an investment? Are they just a hobby? Does it qualify as an investment or not? And, there's arguments on all sides of that. And I've kind of come to the point where it's like, I don't care what you call it, because a lot of it, you're just kind of nitpicking on terminology. But at the end of the day, there are some people that don't care about the financial aspect at all, and that's great. And there's others, you can't argue the fact that there is money to be made in the sports card world. And if it comes down, in my opinion, to intention. I don't really care what you call it, if you call it an investment or not an investment. But if you're buying cards and some of those cards you have the intent to profit from, then there is a investment component, a business component, a money-making component, a speculation component, whatever you want to call it, there's a piece of that comes to play when your focus is trying to make money and trying to be intentional about making money. And I think the other thing is, like many other things, there are some people that are trying to get rich quick, and they're just trying to do something with as minimal work as possible just to try to catch a wave and get rich quick. And there's other people who are putting in the work to build something long-term and sustainable that can have legs, even if we have some peaks and valleys, ups and downs in whatever cycle we're in the sports card world. And that's the approach that I've tried to take. I'm not jumping in with a bunch of really expensive cards that I'm buying at the peak. I'm starting slow, and I built it over time, and I used profits to buy those next things. I didn't use debt to buy those next collections.
That's a good point.
And so as I've built my hundreds of thousands cards worth of inventory, it's all paid for with profits. So even if we do crash out, my entire inventory has been paid for, and anything else I get out of it is all profit. And that is a fun way for me to do it. It's a low risk way for me to generate profits month after month. And I would definitely just reinforce that concept of starting slow, using your profits to buy those next things so that you're not dipping into your life money, you're not dipping into debt, you're not dipping into those types of things. And that can be done with the low end. It can also be done with higher end cards.
Of course.
But the key there is using your success from past transactions to cover the cost of those future transactions.
So many different directions I can go with this. Like, have you personally ever taken money out of your PC to then fund the next purchase or buy something that, you needed to take care of with real life stuff? Any situations like that? Because once again, I think sometimes I maybe only have like 2 or 3 pieces that I have just like, as Brett McGrath would call them, coffin cards. There's like 1 or 2. Most all this stuff, like I want to keep it, but it's also like if I find myself in a bind or just need some extra cash, I'll just get rid of it. I think a lot of times these hardcore collectors are a little too clinchy on their items, so to speak. But what's some examples in your life and your hobby life that's come up?
Yeah, to be honest, not really. The things that are in my own kind of PC, the things that I want to keep forever, I've not really been in a situation where I've had to sell any of those to fund something new. As I've built the inventory, really the closest thing was when I did dip into some of our general kind of life savings to cover a portion of that shop purchase, right, with knowing that the profits that I made for the first several months would be immediately going to repay that back to kind of clear that loan from myself, if you want to call it that, whatever. And was able to do that within the first couple months of running the shop. And so it wasn't a huge amount that I needed to do that for. But if it's just a PC card that I want to add or something like that, I will not buy it until I've got the money in my PayPal or now business checking from the shop in order to be able to cover that. And to some extent, that's meant that I've had to pass on a few collections that would have been pretty nice and I could have done well with, because I wasn't willing to compromise that approach. That's one of the things. My wife does not question what I do with cards because I've had a 5-year track record now of being profitable. And I've had that commitment that I'm not going to use our life money to buy cards or take a chance or to gamble on something with this. And so I've built that credibility and that track record, and I've not been willing to compromise that commitment and that focus to be able to do it that way. And so I just haven't ran into that situation where I've done that. I've just waited another month or 2 months or whatever it might be till I had built up that fund to be able to cover the cost.
It's a great way to do it. That's kind of how I'm doing it. I don't like to go in debt for anything, even in, real life stuff, let alone cards. And I think people just go too hard all in on something. I guess maybe I could make an exception if there was like the one piece that you needed to complete the ultimate grail or whatever. Maybe, but yeah, for the most part, especially if you're, getting it as inventory, like you said, buying out collections and stuff like that. Last question, and this is kind of a broad question, lengthy question, and it ties everything we've been talking about together. So somebody, whether they're into baseball, basketball, wrestling, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic, I don't know, Star Wars, all the different types of cards that are out there. Somebody's wanting to get into this to build a PC, make some money, potentially do what you did and open a shop, and not just open a shop right off. Let's say they have $0. What would you recommend and expect to start with to get to where you're at for somebody who's just got nothing?
Yeah. So if you're literally at $0, if you've got any pieces in your collection right now that are not meaningful to you, I would start by starting to sell those, right? Or if it's none of those things, find something else around the house to sell and to be able to get that seed money. But like I said, when I started this in 2016 and started to get serious about it, it was some of the things from when I was a kid that I no longer cared about. And the first collection I bought was less than $100. And so assuming that you could come up with at least a little bit of something, there are collections on Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist and those types of things that you can pick up for less than $100 that have the potential to get you started with the buying and selling type of stuff. And so I think that's what I would recommend, is starting with a few of the things in your own collection that you've already got that you don't really care about, that aren't meaningful to you. Start with those and look for some small collections on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, and that type of thing that are in that kind of $50, $100 type range. And if you're dedicated to grind it up and do it that way, it's possible. But that would be my recommendation. Check the Blowout forums at blowoutcards.com. Their forums has a buy, sell, trade section where there's a lot of times people are offering up, hey, I've got a flat rate box of base and insert cards from the last several years. I'll send it to you for, $40 delivered or whatever it might be. That's another opportunity to find some of those lower end cards that people are willing to sell cheap that will allow you to get started. And then utilize some of the sites like SportLots there's no listing fee at all on SportLots. And so you can stick stuff out there and see if people are willing to buy it, and you put in the work and the commission all comes out after the fact. And so there's places like that are very low cost to get started. But it takes some work to grind up an inventory big enough to where you can really start to make some money, but it's possible.
Two more questions that I just thought of as you were talking that also pertain to what you're talking about.
Sure.
When you're buying, and I think this will help people too. When you're buying collections, are you doing a lot of sight unseen stuff and giving like a bulk price? And also, are you buying things like gaming cards or in there, stuff that you're not as familiar with, but you're like, yeah, I can still make a profit on this based on the price?
Yeah, usually when I'm buying those collections, it's a big bulk price that we negotiate to. I'll try to take a look at some of the, I don't know if you want to call it quote unquote nicer stuff, or what's this box of top loaded stuff, or these boxes are all just monster boxes full of cards, but this 2-row is all penny sleeved. I'll look through those things to see what's in there. I won't turn things away if there are some Magic cards or some other entertainment cards that I'm not as familiar with. I won't turn them away, because usually the price that I'm getting that stuff at as part of this big collection, it's not going to be meaningful to split it out and say, well, are you going to deduct $10 off of this $200 collection if I don't take those, whatever.
Yeah.
It's not usually worth it. And it usually helps because they want to get rid of the whole thing, right? They don't want to piece it out. And so I usually just take it all with me. But yeah, I don't look through every card, but I try to get a feel for, all right, there's 10 monster boxes. Yeah, this stuff is from the 80s. All right, this stuff's from the early 90s. Oh, this stuff's from 2019, 2020. And this stuff's from the 60s. Yeah, let's jump on that, right? So
Right.
I'll do a quick look to see the types of sets that are included, the types of cards that are included, but I don't go card by card by any means.
And the last question, as part of this major question, I just keep piling on. When you're buying these collections, there's a major misconception that you're buying junk wax base, junk wax base baseball cards, and you're never going to sell those. I personally sell a ton of that stuff. I know you do too. So kind of just dispel that myth.
Yeah, that is part of why I get the cards so cheap, right? Is because people assume that all these baseball cards from the 80s and 90s are worthless, and nobody cares about them, and nobody wants them, and they're just junk. Well, yeah, no, I've got about 37,000 cards at the shop. No, I take that back. About 150,000 cards at the shop. I was looking at the wrong column on my inventory spreadsheet. That are all what I call quarter box cards, and predominantly they're all cards of some of those stars from the 80s and 90s. And I've got every weekend people that come in and sit there for hours going through them, filling up 800 and 1600 count boxes and buying them from me. And I usually cut them a little bit of a deal. I don't sell them at a quarter a piece when they're buying 1,000 of them. But every weekend there's people going through those because they love those players. They love the variety that comes from pursuing these lower end cards. And, I'm selling hundreds and or thousands of those junk wax era stars every weekend at the shop.
That's awesome. Mike, thanks you again for coming on the show. Hopefully everybody watching this is going to get a lot of information. No matter what kind of cards you're into, there's just so much fun to be had and a lot of money responsibly to be made that you can then just buy your own stuff with. And like you said, ultimately end up with a great collection that was free and just having fun building along the way. Let everybody know where they can find you.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions or they want to talk through things more with me, I'm happy to help. That's one of the reasons that I have the blog, and that's why I do the podcast, is to help other people do more of this type of thing. So reach out to me, please. The website is WaxpackHero.com. You can follow me on Twitter at MIke Sommer, SOMMER. And check out the podcast as well, the Waxpack Hero Sports Card Minute. It's available pretty much anywhere podcasts are available. I'd love to hear from you.
Once again, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks everybody for watching. Wow, what a great conversation that was. I hope you guys learned something. I hope there's something in there you can take, and like I said in the first part of this video, apply it to the way that you operate in the hobby. And again, one of the big reasons I do these interview pieces is because I want different perspectives. Maybe I agree with them, maybe I disagree. It doesn't matter. I want different perspectives to help people learn about the hobby, about wrestling cards, about a specific sport, a specific player, a specific card set, the money you spend on it, the way you can make money. There's so many different things to learn within the hobby, and I just want to help everybody learn as much as possible. That being said, if you enjoyed today's video, again, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. Click the videos on the screen for more great wrestling card content. I'll see you in the comments.